the vibration of change, that magical place where life shifts from struggle to ease, from stagnation to forward movement.
Welcome. So grateful you're here today joining us. We're going to be having a wonderful conversation. You might be listening live here on KKNW AM 1150 in the Seattle area, transformationtalkradio.com, anywhere around the world, or of course on Facebook Live, or on my YouTube channel after the fact, or one of the dozens of podcasts it sends up. But wherever and whenever you're joining us from today, I think you're going to be grateful because particularly if you're from the United States, but I think that this is relevant even if you live anywhere else around the world, because where the United States goes, the rest of the world goes. And before I go beyond that teaser and introduce our guest today, I want to say hello to the people behind the technology today, Mr. Benny Mathers at KKNW. Hey, Benny.
Hi, Christine, and it's good to be back in the old hot seat. Got a full belly still from last week and all the wonderful food. Hope you had a great holiday as well.
Yes, I did. And, I start every Thanksgiving awakening and going through the list of things that I'm grateful for. And my goodness, it's such a long list. I'm so grateful. Yes. And this is one of the things I'm grateful for, is being able to connect with you and the people over at TTR, as well as our wonderful guests. And the Christmas season is underway.
Exactly. Well, the list is obviously getting longer too as you're speaking. So, we'll keep it going.
Yes. And is it Jacob over there at TTR today?
That's right. How's it going, Christine?
Hey, Jacob. Thank you for doing what you do and for getting this, helping get this onto our YouTube channel. Of course, Kyle does that behind the scenes, and she's helpful getting guests on. And you guys were, including Kyle, were on my list of gratitude.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate that.
And speaking of gratitude, we are living in really crazy times. And I tell you, I'm starting to spend more and more time thinking about our Constitution here in the United States, thinking about freedom in ways that I never thought about freedom before. And I think our conversation today is a really important one. And our guest today is on the forefront of leading an important conversation about freedom here in the United States. And his name is Daniel Miller. He's the president of the Texas Nationalist Movement, and he's been an outspoken advocate for the Texas independence since 1996. They've been talking about this for a long time. And I have to admit, a long time ago, I thought, this is kind of fringe. And these days I'm thinking, wow, there's something to this. And I think they've got some things to teach us all. He's extensively researched and engaged the issue of self-determination, not just for Texas, but as part of a growing global trend. He's been featured on every major network, and he's been interviewed by every major newspaper in Texas. And he's been on CNBC, CNN, Fox News, and many others. And my kitty's here to join us here. In 2018, he wrote the best-selling book, Texas: Why and How Texas Will Leave the Union. And he's also got a new book out, which that's the book that we're going to be talking about today. He's a sixth-generation Texan. And I have to tell you, I no longer live there, but I believe it's a third-generation Texan, maybe fourth. He was born and raised in northeastern Texas, and he lives there with his wife, Kara. And anyway, he's leading a really important conversation today. I'd like to welcome our guest today, Daniel Miller. And apparently, Indy wanted to say hello to you as well.
Well, that's great. If honestly, if my door was not shut, I would have that exact same problem right now.
Well, it's funny, Daniel, because if I'm starting the show and there's at least one cat in here and they're behaving well, it's like, okay, I'm just going to cross my fingers. We all know these days that we're doing shows from our home, generally speaking.
Right.
And life is, the truth of where we're at, and it includes pets, it includes kids. I think it was last week's show that there was a little boy who opened the door behind his father and threw a dirty sock into a pile that was
Hey, the laundry's got to get done. I mean,
It does. So, Daniel, I'm fascinated by your book, and I'm also fascinated by this conversation about freedom, constitutionality. And I'm always curious about why somebody who is living their life, going about their business, becomes inspired to be a spokesperson for an idea, to inspire others, or to call out things that are not in alignment with who they truly are or who we as a people are. Can you tell us a little bit about your backstory and how you ended up in this position?
Yeah, there was a long road leading up to August 24th, 1996. That's the day that I refer to as my proverbial line in the sand. It's an allusion to the story from the Alamo, where Colonel Travis, on the 12th day of the siege, took all the defenders out in the courtyard, explained to them that no help was coming. And he took out his sword and he drew a line in the sand. And he said, I'm going to stay here and do my duty. He said, but anyone can feel free to leave. And anyone who wants to stay with me, cross this line. And so they were presented with a choice, a clear two path. One side of the line, they might get out in the middle of the night and preserve, and preserve their life. But on one side was almost sure death, but they preserved their honor and bought some precious time for Texas to gain its independence. So, I refer to it as my line in the sand moment. And for me, other than that line in the sand, there was no particular catalyzing moment where there was this one grievance that happened, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. It was somewhat of a slow progression for me as a product of my upbringing, the product of my culture, my environment, my knowledge. And really and truly trying to make a significant difference related to issues of liberty and freedom and, the rule of law and a constitutional republic, and understanding that it was utter futility within the federal system. The federal system is constructed in such a way that it makes that sort of reform impossible. So consequently, it was just sort of a confluence of events. One of those being a book that I read back in 94, 95, I think, called Global Paradox by John Nesbitt. He had written the book. He was the author of Megatrends 2000, big bestsellers. But he wrote Global Paradox ostensibly about the telecommunications revolution and its impact on basically global trade, right? How telecommunications made the world smaller. But he said that the paradox was that the world's trends were pointing overwhelmingly toward economic interdependence on one hand and political independence on the other. And one of the statistics that he threw out was that at the end of World War II, there were roughly 54 recognized, fully sovereign, independent nations around the world. And by the end of the 20th century, there were 192. And so that observation forced a re-examination of the issue of Texas' relationship within the Union, and frankly, all the states, in realizing that if we wanted to be free of the federal system, all we had to do was embrace the reality that 140 other self-governing independent nation states have done, reclaim our right of self-government and reassert our status as an independent nation. So August 24th, 1996, that was the day that I crossed the line in the sand. And as I tell people all the time when I speak, I'm still at it today, not just speaking about it, but working about it. And I'm going to continue until the job gets done or until the grave diggers pat me in the face with a shovel.
You said something that I think is a really important topic to kind of draw out a little bit more. You call this a constitutional republic. Most people think the United States is a democracy. Why do you call it a constitutional republic?
Well, because it is. The democratic element of it is the fact that we still get a vote, but there is a rule of law. It's not majority rules here across all spheres. Otherwise, 50% plus one of the people could determine that people named Daniel Miller should be taken out and executed. And, that's just not the kind of society that we want to live in. So, as a constitutional republic, we have a governmental framework where the democratic vote takes place within that framework. And then those results are carried out with the primary function of government being the preservation of the rights and liberties of the individual citizens, period. I mean, that is the primary function of government. Anything else it does is weighed in that balance, whether it is in support of that or not in support of that. And if it's not in support of that, then it's something that government shouldn't be doing. So, calling us a constitutional republic, I think is, that discussion about a constitutional republic is important, because most people need to understand that the United States of America is technically not a constitutional republic. It is I guess it is in the loosest sense of the word, but the United States of America is actually a political and economic union of individual sovereign constitutional republics. You can, you begin to look at, say, in the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 10, where it lists the things that states are forbidden from doing, and then realize that anything, according to the 10th Amendment, anything that is not granted to the federal government or forbidden to the states is reserved to the states and the people, thereby making the federal system a delegation of limited sovereignty from the individual states. So, the way that I think that people are looking at it now is that the United States is effectively this monolithic single nation state, even when the framers of the Constitution, including James Madison, explicitly said that the Constitution was not a national one, but a federal one. They look at it as this monolithic nation state, and it's not. Each of our states is meant by design, by construction, by intent to be self-governing independent nation states that are bound together in a system called the United States of America, and collectively in that system doing a very limited number of things like single currency, free trade. It's essentially a free trade agreement, mutual defense, maintenance of post roads, very limited functions. And beyond that, we're supposed to be self-governing right here in our own states.
Well, for anybody who's traveled around the United States, I mean, first of all, you notice how different the culture is in different parts of this country. And over the last year and a half or so, I think what's been illuminated is that how the individual states are governing in, our current situation varies quite dramatically. And in fact, I saw somebody post something about how they had moved from California to Texas recently, and they said they felt like they had moved to another country. So the things that I happen to live in a state with quite a few restrictions, and it's a very different kind of environment. And I think that there are various things that go against our constitutional rights, but that's a whole other conversation. But it seems to me that there are many in Texas, including people in government, who have a very different perspective on how things should be implemented. And it's really clear that the governments are functioning, within the states, and the freedom of the people within that state, within the states, is very different.
Sure. Well, it's like I look at it this way, and I think people, to a certain extent, be it nostalgia, be it aspiration, whatever it is, they have sort of this idealized, romanticized view that from sea to shining sea, we're all one people, we all think the same way, and it hasn't been that way for a very long time. Yeah. And I go back to the quote, I think it was from Andrew Breitbart, who said that politics and policy are downstream from culture. But I would even add to that and say that culture is downstream from worldview. And what we're finding here is that those policy implementations, just like you were talking about, are functions of a culture, and that culture is a function of people's worldview. And one of the things that is abundantly clear is that you cannot govern people that have radically different worldviews in one political system. Especially when, and this is why you get polarized politics, specifically at the federal level, so intense, why it burns so passionate and hot, is because it's no longer just, Republicans and Democrats may differ on policy. Right now, you have people that identify with those party monikers that disagree on fundamental issues. They have clearly different worldviews about the rights of the individual, where those rights come from, how we should be governed. I mean, they're radically different, and as those begin to separate even more, you're going to see this. And this is something I wrote about in my first book. When I wrote Line in the Sand, I talked about how if we do not embrace the idea that the states need to reassert their status as independent nations and not try to govern one another in this ridiculous Punch and Judy show of, beating each other over the head every 2 to 4 years, then what we're going to do is it's going to end up like Yugoslavia, where you had, now we got clear examples in Iraq, where you have people that are in these artificial nation states that have radically different worldviews, and the only way that they could be governed was with a dictatorship, because that was the only thing to keep them in check. And as free-loving people here, that's going to be totally unacceptable to us, and we don't want that type of balkanization here. And frankly, the way that we head that off at the pass is we embrace the right of self-determination. We embrace the principles in Article 1, Section 2 of the Texas Constitution that says that all political power is inherent in the people, and that the people have the inalienable right to alter, reform, or abolish their government in such manner as they may think expedient. We acknowledge that right, and then we let states like Texas go to the polls, vote, and leave if that's what the people choose.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, because instead of allowing these sorts of conversations, what often happens, I think, is that people get into their tribal position. That there's so much tribalism these days that we can't seem to have many conversations about opposing views, because right. If there's something that's brought up that is in conflict with somebody's perspective, then what they do is they'll think black or white, like, okay, if you have that view of wanting to leave, then you must be a white supremacist, or, like fill in the blank, somehow you're bad because you've got this different perspective. And I think that what's happening right now is there's like a great deal more of that tribalism, but there are also people awakening to the fact that the things that we thought were true and ubiquitous across our United States, actually, it's not the same. We have a different level of freedom. We have different perspectives. We definitely have different cultures. And it's something that I think that we need to talk about, whether we are, 50 states together or 49, or, 50 different individual countries, so to speak. But one of the things I'm fascinated with is I think that there's so many important things that you're talking about. And yet I have to ask myself, like, why can't you work this out within the context of being a part of this federal, this federal joining together of 49 other states?
Well, there's several different reasons, right? You would have to say that these situations could be fixed in the context of a federal union like we have right now. You would have to believe that it can be fixed, that it can be reformed. And I go back to, that day, August 24th, 1996, and I look at that snapshot of what the federal government was, and I ask myself, after every 2 to 4 years being promised reform, repeal, putting the federal government back in its box, is it any better? Is it the same, or is it worse? And, I look at it and I realize it's worse. It's far worse. We've lost probably about, I guess from an inflationary standpoint, we've lost about 1.5 times value on money. We've seen the federal debt skyrocket to almost $30 trillion. We've seen a massive lurch toward neo-Marxist ideology coming out of the federal government, and no one blinks an eye. No one bats an eye at it. We've seen further encroachments on the sovereignty of the individuals, and so at this day, as it stands right now, we're living in a state being crushed by 180,000 pages of federal laws, rules, and regulations administered by 2.5 million unelected bureaucrats.
Mhm.
Those 2.5 million unelected bureaucrats are not there to work for us. They're there to work on us. And, and so you have to ask yourself, can it be reformed? And the answer, there is no track record. For 70 plus years, it's only gotten worse. So, but I think the thing people need to understand is self-governing independent nation states cooperate, work together, and act together around the world every single solitary day without ceding their governance and sovereignty to some supranational body. I think back to World War II, and I think about all the self-governing independent nation states that fielded men that stormed the beaches of Normandy. But no one ever said that, I'm sorry, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, everybody else that fought for the Allies, no one would ever suggest that they couldn't cooperate unless they took a knee to Washington, D.C. And when we look at the world, that is the way that the world has worked for the last 75 years, as we've seen this explosion of independent self-governing nation states. But just like, take the issue of defense that I just used, just like, the countries that are members of NATO, Germany is a member of NATO, but no one would ever suggest that Germany must be a state of the United States for us to share common defense concerns and cooperate with one another. Take free trade, from the trade deals that we have right now. Technically speaking, what we have in the United States is a free trade agreement between the 50 states. We can move goods and services with minimal limitations. Well, the United States, as collectively, has free trade agreements with 22 other self-governing independent nation states around the world. But no one would ever suggest, as a byproduct of free trade, that Jordan or South Korea or Israel or any of these countries or Mexico or Canada, where the United States has a free trade agreement, that to be able to have that type of deal, that they should have to be subservient to 2.5 million unelected bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. So there is a modern way for states that no longer want to be under that federal umbrella to cooperate, to work together, just not cede their sovereignty and their governance to a bunch of bureaucrats that they didn't elect, forcing policies on them that they don't want.
That's interesting. So as you're discussing this, to me, it doesn't sound like a big deal, and yet it's incredibly threatening to many. Why do you think that is?
Well, two reasons, and really two sets of people that are threatened by it. One is those people that don't understand it, right? And you cure that with information, helping people understand, to contextualize, to give them all the data that they need to understand how it works. Because you may not be surprised. It really, fundamentally, how many people don't understand the nature of the relationship between their state and the federal government, right? A good example is the number one question that we get all the time about Texas is, what happens to Social Security? And we have to remind everyone that current federal policy is, as a recipient of federal pension benefits, you do not have to live in the United States to collect those benefits. The only prohibition is you can't move to North Korea, Syria, Cuba, or Belarus. Right.
Interesting.
So there are certain, or the fact that people don't understand, like Texas is a donor state. We overpay anywhere from 103 to 160 billion dollars into the federal system annually, which, when you have that fact and people say, well, what are you going to do with all that without all that federal money? It's like, well, it gets to stay in our pocket. We don't have to send it to Washington, D.C. to get a 40% haircut before it comes back. So that's the first group of people that and we have to address them. We have to address their concerns. And one of the reasons that we have the website up, texitnow.org, to answer the 100 most asked questions in excruciating detail, because it's what people want. And one of the reasons that I wrote the Texit book. But the second group of people that are really kind of twisted about this are people that have a vested interest in Texas being subservient to the federal government. That would be the political establishment or those social engineers that look to the federal government to have Texas dominated, or the states dominated by that federal tyranny and bureaucracy. It's exactly why when we had in this last legislative session, one of the special sessions, we enacted some pretty strict voter integrity requirements. And honestly, they're not strict, they're common sense. And you had a pack of Democrat state legislators break quorum and fly to Washington, D.C. and beg the federal government to intervene. Those are the kind of people that are freaked out about Texas.
Yeah. And so let's talk a little bit about those voter laws, because there's a whole narrative out there that it's, in Texas, they're trying to prevent a whole lot of people from voting. And how do you address that?
Well, it's a lie. First and foremost, it's not about preventing anyone from voting. It was all of this batch of voter integrity legislation was all about maintaining and restoring confidence in the election system. Right. And there are people out there, and we heard the debates on the floor of the legislative session talk about, the big lie, that's what they call it, about Trump having the election stolen from him. And, that's the kind of thing that they want to do, is they want to characterize it. But Texas has had significant challenges with voter integrity for many, many years. And incrementally, the Texas legislature has attempted to address it. But it's a pretty Byzantine system. When you've got 30 million Texans, 16 million of which are now registered voters, and you have that system fragmented among 254 counties, which means 254 election officials that are the head of those under the umbrella of the Texas Secretary of State. You've got to do everything you can statutorily to make sure, number one, that the only people that are voting are the ones that are legally allowed to vote. You have to make sure that any of those people that conspire to break those laws are punished, and punished severely, because our vote is sacred. Every bad vote dilutes the vote of everyone else. And then finally, you have to make sure that you make the system immune, or at least protected against bad actors that are in official positions that would manipulate the system to their own ends. And we've actually seen that. Texas is infamous for this, with the election of Lyndon Johnson. With that particular ballot box, there's actually a state representative that's in the Texas House right now, whose grandfather is the one that Lyndon Johnson stole the election from with a fraudulent ballot box. So, the reforms are not really reforms. They're really just common sense implementations. What
are some of those implementations? Can you give us some specific examples? Because the narrative that's out there, it's like, it's going to make it too difficult for people to go and vote. You're not making it easy. So tell us what some of those implementations are.
Well, one of the things that they did was they put a ban on drive-through voting, which was one of the big challenges that they had was, okay, you're going to do drive-through voting. How do you determine for real that the person that is voting is the one that is voting? So they were using the drive-through voting to skirt some of the voter ID laws. The other is ballot harvesting, which has been another issue. They banned the unsolicited mailing of mail-in ballots. One of the things that they have seen a tremendous amount of abuse in over the years has been mail-in ballots. And so you had some of the election officials in some of the large counties here in Texas that just wanted to blanket mail-in ballots. Well, they have exposed on more than one occasion rings of people that literally will go get those mail-in ballots. They will fill them out on behalf of someone else, vote for them, and send them in. So, but between all of those things, it tightened it up. They made one mistake that they're going to have to go correct in hopefully we can get a fourth special session on this. But unfortunately, they accidentally lowered the penalty on some of the violation of the voter laws. But it's, look, one of the things that I cite, and we haven't talked about this. I announced back in October that I'm running as a Republican candidate for lieutenant governor. And one of the things that I absolutely want to see, specifically on the election integrity issue, is I want to see all of those election penalties restored back to felonies at a minimum, state jail felonies. And I want to see those particular election crimes added to our state RICO statutes, so that when we encounter these organized bands of people that are conspiring and working to undermine our election laws and break them, that we can charge them as a criminal conspiracy. So there's still work to do here.
So you're not saying that a shut-in can't get a mail-in ballot?
Absolutely not. I mean, that has been a feature and function of Texas laws for many, many, many years. What we're saying is the unsolicited mailing of ballots by these election officials at the county level to every eligible voter in Texas, where we have seen fraud. And so it's about protecting the fraud. So if you're a shut-in or you're sick, absolutely, you have the ability to request a mail-in ballot. But this blanket, and of course, it's always from these places where these various areas where they have a lot to gain if they skirt around those election laws. Harris County has been one of the biggest fights related to election integrity down there in Houston, and it's just been really a really tough fight against those guys, because they want to just kind of make it really loose. And frankly, if you can't guarantee that the people that are voting are the ones that are supposed to be voting, make it totally accessible for people that are supposed to be voting. But if you can't guarantee that the vote that is cast is from a legitimate voter, then what you've essentially done is you have eroded confidence in the system, and every illegal vote is a dilution of the legal votes that have come in.
Yeah, and there's been a very different narrative about it. It's about, again, it's they've pulled the racism card, and you're trying to prevent people from voting, and it's what you're saying sounds very different than some of the narratives that I've heard.
Well, they went on a tour, and those guys are really quick to drop the race card on this issue to make it seem like this was a racial issue, but it has nothing to do with race. And I will tell you, when they came back, when they had to slink back into the Texas Capitol, their colleagues that stayed, that helped pass that legislation, were furious, because how do you sit next to someone who just got done going on a slash and burn mission on national news, calling you a racist because you wanted voter integrity? And so it's made for some serious polarization even inside the Texas Capitol right now.
I bet. So what kind of support do you have there in Texas for Texit?
Yeah, this is a beautiful thing. I joke often, and I say, we even though I got engaged in this fight in 1996, the Texas Nationalist Movement was not founded until 2005. And I joke all the time, and I tell people, when we founded the TNM, Texit was polling in single digits. But the good news is that we've always polled higher than the approval rating of the U.S. Congress, which polls somewhere right above or below that of leprosy, right? So, the fact is that we've watched the needle mover. We've seen our work make a difference. 2009, we saw right at a majority, right at a majority of Republican voters in support. Just about 45% of independent voters and 15% of Democrats. 2014, those numbers went up to 54% Republican, half of independents, and 35% of Democrats. And so, where we are right now, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that if we go to a vote on Texit tomorrow, we win. And we don't win by a little, we win by a lot. And a lot of that is, it's not just the polling numbers that are telling us that. Internal polling, there's third-party polling data, but it really is about what we are seeing among the people of Texas. And it's because we're asking them this question. If Texas was already right now a free, independent, self-governing nation among nations, right? We were self-governing in every respect. We had control over our own border and immigration policy. We had our own currency, our own military. I mean, everything you can think of. And instead of talking about Texas, we were talking about joining the Union. Knowing everything you know about the federal government right now, today, would you vote to join the Union? And for the vast majority of Texans, the switch flips and they understand what's at stake here. Because if they wouldn't vote to join, they would not vote to stay. So we know, and it's one of the reasons that we've been pushing so hard for a Texas referendum here.
Mhm. So how does that work in relationship to the Constitution, the federal government? Like, how do you disentangle the state from this union?
Well, let's take something off the table really quickly, because right now I can guarantee you someone is listening or watching and they're saying, you can't do that. It's unconstitutional. It's illegal, right? Those are the two things that they love to throw up. And first and foremost, the response to that is, that's great. Please pull out your Constitution or your federal law books and point out where there is a prohibition against it in the Constitution or in federal law. Doesn't exist. Okay. So the spoiler alert for those frantically Googling the U.S. Constitution right now, it's not in there. Okay. As a matter of fact, Article 1, Section 10, which I mentioned earlier, lists everything states are forbidden from doing. There is nothing in Article 1, Section 10 forbidding states from withdrawing from the Union. So that means under the 10th Amendment, that means that power is reserved to the state. So for us, we look at Article 1, Section 2, which I also quoted earlier, which reserves it as an inalienable right to the people of Texas, right, to alter, reform, or abolish our government. So constitutional grounds, we're fine. There is no federal legal prohibition against it. And so the question becomes, what does that mean for us? What does that process look like? Well, obviously, I mentioned a referendum a moment ago. We have to have a referendum here. Article 1, Section 2 of our Constitution is very clear that it's a question for the people. It is an expression of political will. So this has to come to a vote of the people, very much like we saw in Scotland in 2014, or with the Brexit voting in the UK, just a year later or so, 2 years later. But that's what people should be familiar with, right? Going to the polls, voting on this issue, a very simple question: should the state of Texas reassert its status as an independent nation? Period. That's the question.
Mhm.
So once that happens, then we still don't even, literally nothing changes the day after that vote happens, except for the fact that the Texas government and the legislature have to get in gear and they have to address four things. Okay. And really it's four categories of things, but it's really for them about putting the results of that vote into practice, right? We've got to, now that the people have voted, now they have to act upon it. So the four issues, constitutional issues, and I'll just cover these briefly. Constitutional issues. So that would be constitutional amendments that bring the current state constitution into sync with that of a self-governing independent nation state. And it's very simple things like changing the name from state of Texas to Republic of Texas, right? Or, changing the office of governor to the office of president and lieutenant governor to vice president, however that needs to be accomplished, whatever needs to be accomplished constitutionally happens in that phase and can be it can happen with a blanket amendment that makes wholesale changes. We did that back in the 60s with what was called the Deadwood Amendments. So the constitutional issues, there's statutory issues that have to be dealt with. Okay. So we've got issues that particularly dealing with state agencies, which will have to deal with expansion of some of those agencies, absorbing some of the functions that are carried out by federal agencies here in Texas. The good news about that is, and something most people don't understand is that there is a clear analog for every cabinet level office on the federal side here in Texas, including the military, right? We have a 3-branch military here called the Texas Military Department. So you have those statutory issues that have to be addressed. The third is international covenants, treaties, and agreements. There are very mundane international covenants that Texas will want to sign on to, like the convention that deals with international air traffic, right? So coordinating air traffic control. Okay, so things of that nature. And then finally are really that when we start dealing with the federal government, and those are the negotiated issues, like, what about Texas portion of the federal debt, or what about the funds from Texas workers that sit in the Medicare trust fund? What do we do about federal military installations and buildings? So there's a bundle of negotiated issues, but it's a very orderly process that we go through.
So, would people from other states be able to freely come and go, visiting Texas, visiting their friends, their family,
Right.
doing some of the fun things that people like to do when they go to Texas?
Sure. Well, it's interesting because, when we talk about Texas, and particularly, I mean, and it happens with people here, but particularly people outside, there's this image that pops up in people's minds that suddenly Texas will be Australia and surrounded by a body of water, or there'll be walls around the entire border or something along that nature, and it's just not the case. Look, we even pre-EU, we saw free movement of people among those nation states, with very minimal, just carry your ID, that type of travel.
Right.
One thing a lot of people don't know is that they're actually, we have a tendency to focus on illegal immigration related to our border with Mexico, but many
Sure.
people don't understand that there are literally, I think it's 1 million legal crossings
Mhm.
between Mexico and the United States every day, with nothing more than what's called a border transit card, right? Basically an ID that you flip if asked.
Right.
So,
And it used to be that way in with Canada and the US, but with the things that have been going on, there have been all sorts of controls about that. But it's,
right.
it can be relatively easy to cross borders during normal times.
Yeah. I mean, we have to remember, when you look at Texas is, is larger than France. And, these states, if you were to look at it like, many of these other countries, particularly, Western republics and democracies, people will get in their car and they'll start off in their country one morning, and they'll have lunch in another one, and then drive to a third one for dinner, and then come home. So these are not insurmountable issues. There are actually ways that are current policy to handle those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. So let me play devil's advocate here for a minute, because I think that there's this pervasive attitude that we all need to be thinking in terms of helping the collective, whether we're talking about border crossings, or whether we're talking about national mandates, or whether we're talking about federal taxes that, so Texas pays more, but Texas, has oil, and Texas has some more successful businesses, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
So people are saying you don't care about the rest of the country if you withdraw. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think, we hear that a lot, particularly from establishment politicians when they're asked about the Texas issue here. They say that they believe that we should lead and not leave. But what they have to understand is that there are a large contingent of people out there in the various states that are watching their freedoms infringed every day, their rights being taken away from them, their economic, they're even an opportunity for economic prosperity being stolen from them. And let's face it, those people have no place to go. So if we want to lead, then we lead on the advancing the principles of self-government and liberty. And by giving people like that a place that they can go to, because there is not going to be a freer place on earth than Texas, probably. By giving those people a place that they can call home. But more than that, for those who don't want to put GTT on their door, gone to Texas like they did back in the 1830s and 40s, and come here to hopefully set an example for them on how their state can reassert its status as an independent nation. And on the other side of that, trade with us, travel with us, engage in mutual defense with us, do the things that nation states do every single solitary day. So whether it's by reasserting our status as an independent nation, right? If that is what we do, whether that gives these people a place of safe haven that aligns with their principles and values, or whether it inspires them and the people in their state to do likewise and to raise their principles above their fealty to 2.5 million unelected bureaucrats, either way, the result is good.
I think about how many people have been moving from California, Washington State, Oregon to places like Texas and Florida, where there are greater freedoms. I think that there are definitely some ways in which Texas is different from so many of the states that appeals to people who are freedom loving. And there's this huge cultural divide. I think about, I've got friends in Texas, and I think about talking to them about, going into a store and how different it is in terms of some of the mandates, in terms of the behavior, in terms of the amount of fear, just going about doing normal daily things. And it's very appealing to people who prefer greater freedom. Right. People who believe in the United States Constitution and the rights it confers to its citizens. Do you feel that Texas backing out is somehow leaving some of the rest of the country in the lurch?
Yeah, I don't think it's backing out, though. I think that's the thing. We're not people to cut and run. We're people that will stand up and fight. And we have to remember that our independence is one of those things we'll fight for, right? You got to understand, and what I try to explain to people who talk about that cut and run thing is that it really is about what you prioritize, what you believe, right? If we talk about and we say that we really esteem these principles, then we have to stand up for them. I go back to what Thomas Jefferson said, that he said that our attachment to no nation on earth should supplant our attachment to liberty, right? And the context under which he wrote that. And so it really is, do you value being in the United States of America, the political and economic construct, more than you value the principles of liberty? Because if you're willing to say that, then that is part of the great divide, is it not? And I think when you put it in terms like that and help people understand that, look, our right of self-government is an inalienable right. Article 1, Section 1 of the Texas Constitution starts off with the words, Texas is a free and independent state, and even says that the perpetuity of the Union depends on the right of local self-government unimpaired to all the states. Mm-hmm. So I put it like this, and I'll tell you, because when I'm out there pep talking everybody, I have to remind them that when we talk about the right of self-government as an inalienable right, I have to remind them of what some other inalienable rights are, which are the right to worship according to the dictates of your conscience, freedom of speech, right? Freedom of assembly, right to keep and bear arms. I mean, these are all recognized inalienable rights. And so I say, when someone comes to you and wants to deprive you of any of those rights, you're so passionate and worked up. You're going to fight like the third monkey on the ramp to Noah's Ark, right? But what is it about this? What is it about self-government? Understand that when they encroach on our right of self-government and our sovereignty, then we've got to be that passionate. We got to be that fired up about it, because if, it's like someone knocked on the door, said, give me all of your guns. Well, Texans be like, you don't have a big enough truck, right? But if they knock on the door and go, I'm sorry, we're not going to give you the right to vote on reasserting your status as an independent nation. Well, that's the same type of deprivation. And so, people who are, they're a little bit hinky about withdrawing. They got to understand this is not about us. Yes, we are withdrawing membership, but we're doing so for the purpose of advancing and protecting the principles that we say are even more fundamental than making sure that we pay taxes to Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so, I've got to bring this up because this is an issue for many people when they think about Texas, and that is how abortion rights certain abortion rights were taken away from women who are citizens of Texas. Do the people of Texas support that?
I think it depends on which aspect of it that you're talking about. I mean, look, the people of Texas are overwhelmingly pro-life, right? I mean, that is a given. And, obviously the controversy as it stands right now has been over the heartbeat bill. And the debate and the discussion around abortion is going to always center around what about the rights of the child. That's where it's going to boil, what it's all going to come down to. And frankly, what we have seen from Texas and many other states are legislation that has really been constructed to invoke a fight at the Supreme Court so that the issue of Roe v. Wade could be reopened. I mean, we've seen it here. I think, was it Mississippi or Alabama? One of the two. Iowa passed a law pretty recently. So that's what it's been about, because ultimately what it has come down to is Roe v. Wade was a federal usurpation of state sovereignty. It really was a state sovereignty issue. And here in Texas, as a pro-life state, that will always continue to be the examination around the issue of abortion is what about the rights of the child? What about the child? And you will see that it always stokes some of the greatest passion among people. But, here in Texas, we have a hard time looking at it and going, okay, if indeed that is a child, then why can someone unilaterally deprive it of life just on a whim? Right here in Texas, we only have, the rights are guaranteed to the individual, and they can only be deprived of life under due process of law. So, if the child is indeed a person, if a drunk driver hit a pregnant mother and the child died, that person can be charged with homicide. Why is that not extended out? I'm not saying that we're charging people with homicide, but I'm saying the definition of that child as a person means that they should enjoy the full rights as any one of us. Because at the moment that we deprive the most innocent of their life and their liberty, then we're all fair game.
Yeah, and I understand the argument on both sides. And I think that people who are pro-abortion rights would be shocked if they understood how extensive those rights have become, and some of the horrific things that have been done to babies that are nearly full term. So it's the kind of thing where it's sort of shocking how extreme that it's gotten, and it's an issue with a slippery slope either direction. But I definitely understand your perspective and the perspective of many Texans. And it's interesting to me that there are many people out there who believe in a woman's right to choose, but they don't think that if the woman or a man wants to choose whether or not to get something in their arm, that they should have that right, which just blows my mind. But that's a whole other conversation, probably for another network sometime. Okay, so just a final message before we run out of time. First of all, what's your website again?
Yeah, I would encourage anyone who has any questions about Texit to go visit our website at texitnow.org. Texitnow.org, TEXIT now.org. Okay, quick final message, like in a minute or less. Absolutely. Here's what it boils down to. If you at a minimum, if this conversation has stimulated you, re-examine the relationship between your state and the federal government, and ask some of the hard questions that we've talked about here today. And I believe that what you'll find is, at the end of the day, that you and your state have a better opportunity to govern yourselves than 2.5 million unelected bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. Yeah, and I'm all for being a sovereign citizen of the world. Thank you so much, Daniel, for joining us here today. And thank you all who joined us. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. If you'd like to empower yourself to step further into your vibration of change, please visit my website at christineupchurch.com, where you can learn more about my insights, upcoming events, and private sessions.